I always thought the worst thing an HOA could do was issue petty fines, but that belief shattered the morning I stood ankle-deep in shattered metal, staring at the ruins of my grandfather's windmill, my ranch's pride, my family's legacy, and the heartbeat of our land. The windmill had survived storms, droughts, even a wildfire, but it couldn't survive her. The HOA president everyone called Hurricane Helen. And trust me, the nickname didn't even come close to describing the destruction she brought. I remember the sound first like thunder rolling straight through the ranch. When I stepped outside, dust still floating through the air, I saw tracks of the construction vehicle she'd hired, leading straight back to her pristine suburban palace. And my windmill? Torn apart. Bent steel, splintered wood, blades twisted like cheap foil. It looked less like vandalism and more like a surgical strike. My fists shook. My jaw locked. My pulse hammered hard enough to drown out everything except one truth: Helen had declared war. But why? Why now? Why something this personal? I got my answer minutes later when Helen strutted up my driveway wearing oversized sunglasses like she was entering a courtroom. She lifted her clipboard, glanced at my destroyed windmill, and said one sentence that nearly made my vision go white. It was an unapproved structure. I warned you. Consider this your final compliance notice. Final compliance notice. That windmill powered half my ranch, kept my livestock watered, and had stood there decades before Helen even moved into the subdivision the city jammed against my fence line. She hadn't warned me she'd targeted me. And worst of all, she smirked while she did it. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I just stared at her, searching for even a flicker of humanity. I found none. Instead, she clicked her pen, scribbled a fine for debris visible from the public road, handed it to me, and strutted away like she'd just performed a civic duty instead of gutting my history. That's when something inside me hardened. She didn't just break my windmill. She broke the last thread of patience I had left. And as I stood there, surrounded by destruction, I made a quiet promise: I would make Helen regret ever stepping onto my land. And oh, she would. Because I already knew exactly how to hit her where it hurt her precious luxury pool. A storm was coming. And this time, I was the one bringing it. Before I destroyed Helen's pool, before the river diversion, before the cops showed up yelling and pointing fingers, there was a moment, just one, where I considered walking away. I stood at the edge of my ranch, staring at the dry creek bed that used to flow peacefully between her neighborhood and my land. It was a natural divider, a silent boundary, one we'd respected for years. But Helen changed everything the moment she brought that demolition crew. And she didn't stop. 2 hours after the destruction of my windmill, I received another notice. And then another. And then a third. All delivered by smug HOA board members who strutted across my property like they owned it. Fines for excessive grass height. Fines for unapproved fencing. Fines for visible ranch equipment causing neighborhood eye discomfort. Meanwhile, I still hadn't even picked up the pieces of my windmill. That's when I understood, this wasn't punishment. It was a campaign. A coordinated effort to push me off my own land so Helen could expand her perfect little kingdom. But she didn't know my ranch's history. She didn't know my grandfather built the first irrigation line here with his bare hands. She didn't know my father fought tooth and nail to keep this land during the drought of '97. And she didn't know me, not yet. So I lifted the broken windmill blade, tossed it aside, and walked to the old water control gate at the creek. Rusted, forgotten, ignored by everyone except me. The city hadn't maintained it in years. But it still worked. And with just a bit of effort, I could redirect that creek's flow anywhere on my own land. Or, anywhere off it. I didn't plan revenge yet. Not fully. Not until Helen showed up again, this time screaming at me from the other side of the fence that my cows were breathing too loud. That's when the last switch flipped. She wanted a war? She was going to get a war. I spent the next 2 days repairing the gate, clearing the old channels, and scouting the slope behind Helen's backyard. Her pool sparkled like a jewel. Her patio furniture looked like it belonged in a luxury catalog. Everything was an Instagram fantasy. But all of it depended on water. Water she didn't control. Water I did. So, quietly, patiently, and with a level of determination fueled entirely by her cruelty, I made a plan. A clean, precise, devastating plan. I wasn't going to flood her pool. No. I was going to drain it so fast she'd think the earth swallowed it whole. The morning I put my plan into motion, the sky was painfully clear, one of those bright, sharp blue mornings where every sound seems louder than usual. Birds chirping, gravel crunching beneath my boots, the low groan of the ranch gate as I pushed it open, all of it felt amplified, like the world knew something big was coming. But nothing was louder than the roaring frustration still pounding in my chest. I started by walking the entire length of the old creek bed, boots sliding through the dust where water once flowed. The walls of the creek curved naturally toward the boundary behind Helen's backyard, bending just slightly enough to make what I needed possible. At the end of the dry stretch lay the city's forgotten diversion valve, a thick iron mechanism half swallowed by weeds. Most people didn't know it existed. Helen definitely didn't. But I did. My grandfather had shown it to me when I was 10, explaining how it could redirect the flow into different channels depending on the season. Never misuse it, he'd warned. Water is power. Power must be handled with respect. I wasn't breaking that rule. I was balancing it. I knelt, brushed dirt from the metal casing, and studied the inlet pipe. Even after years of disuse, the structure was intact. The city's repairs were sloppy, but the bones were strong. All I had to do was reopen the secondary channel, clear some debris, and let the creek do what nature intended, follow gravity. And gravity pointed straight toward Helen's property line. But first, I needed the water. The upstream reservoir released a controlled flow every Thursday afternoon, something the HOA had never paid attention to because they didn't rely on it. I did. My ranch lived by it. And today was Thursday. Perfect. I spent the next 6 hours clearing branches, widening a narrow slope, and bending a metal guide plate to coax the water exactly where I wanted it. Sweat dripped down my back, dirt coated my arms, and at one point I sliced my palm on a rusted bolt, but I barely noticed. Every shovel strike, every tug of the crowbar, every drop of sweat brought me closer to the moment Helen would finally understand she'd picked the wrong rancher to push around. When the sun finally dipped low, I climbed the ridge overlooking her property. Her pool glowed turquoise under the patio lights, pristine and perfect. It looked expensive. Fragile. Delicate. And soon, it was going to be thirsty. Very thirsty. Because in less than 24 hours, Helen's precious luxury oasis wouldn't just lose water, it would vanish. By the time Friday morning rolled in, the air felt heavier, thick with anticipation, like the land itself sensed what I was about to do. I woke before sunrise, boots already by the door, tools packed, gloves waiting on the counter. Today wasn't a normal ranch morning. Today was execution day. Not violence, not chaos, just justice delivered through the oldest force known to mankind, running water. I headed toward the creek, moving fast enough to kick dust clouds behind me. The distant rumble of the scheduled reservoir release hadn't begun yet, but I knew it would start soon, just as it did every week. I reached the diversion gate, knelt down, and tightened the final bolts I had left loose the night before. Everything was ready. Every measurement, every angle, every inch of the channel carved with purpose. It wasn't sabotage. It was strategy. As I worked, the early sunlight spilled across Helen's backyard. Her pool glimmered like a blue gem, perfectly calm. Her patio umbrella swayed gently. and at 6:11 a.m. sharp, I saw her strutting out in a silk robe, latte in hand. Even from the ridge, I could see the satisfaction on her face, as if she believed she'd broken me. As if she thought destroying my windmill had ended the fight. But she didn't know I had an entire family's worth of grit and fire behind me. She sat on her lounge chair, scrolling through her tablet, no doubt preparing more HOA infractions to toss my way. My jaw tightened, my hands balled into fists, but I forced myself to stay focused. Emotion couldn't drive today, precision had to. Then, right on schedule, I heard it. A distant, low roar echoing through the hills. The reservoir release. My heart punched against my ribs. This was it. I sprinted back down the slope to the diversion gate, wiped my hands on my jeans, and gripped the wheel with both palms. It creaked when I twisted it, old metal grinding against older metal, but the mechanism still obeyed, slowly opening the secondary channel I'd cleared. Water began trickling in first, then rushing, then thundering as the full flow surged toward the newly carved path. I stepped back and watched it bend, turn, and follow the slope exactly as intended, straight toward Helen's backyard. Not to flood it, not to drown it, but to slip beneath the tiles, under the soil, through the foundation of her precious pool's filtration line. The force would yank the water backward, draining it out like someone pulling the plug on a giant bathtub. And in minutes, she'd have no idea what hit her. I grinned. War had officially begun. The water struck Helen's property line with a silent force, slipping into the earth beneath her manicured lawn like a thief in broad daylight. I watched from the ridge, heart pounding as the redirected flow tunneled downward, carving its way toward the weak spot I'd identified days earlier, the main intake pipe feeding her pool's circulation system. It wasn't sabotage in the traditional sense. I didn't break anything. I didn't enter her property. I simply let nature take a path it had once taken before the HOA rerouted it for aesthetic purposes. All I did was open the door they had sealed shut. Down below, Helen had no clue. She paced across her patio, barking into her phone, probably complaining about my ranch again. Every gesture, every dramatic flick of her hand, made the satisfaction burn warmer in my chest. Then it happened. A sharp metallic pop echoed across the yard. Helen froze. Her head jerked toward the pool. The water line trembled. Then it dropped slowly at first, then rapidly, spiraling downward like a whirlpool. Her scream sliced through the morning. She sprinted to the pool's edge, waving her arms like she could somehow stop the impossible. Within minutes, her luxurious oasis transformed into a gaping empty bowl. Cracks began appearing along the tiles, snapping like brittle bones. The patio lights flickered as the pump sucked in air, choking on nothingness. Helen fell to her knees, clutching her hair like she'd witnessed the end of the world. I should have felt guilt. Maybe even remorse. But all I felt was clarity. She took my windmill, my history, my livelihood. I took her pool, her shrine, her pride. And I wasn't done yet. Then I saw the moment realization struck her. She lifted her gaze toward the ridge, eyes narrowing as if she sensed I was watching. Even from that distance, her expression sharpened into pure fury. She grabbed her phone again, stabbing the screen with trembling fingers. Sirens wailed in the distance moments later. And just like that, she wasn't screaming about water anymore. She was screaming about me. She had called the cops. And I was ready. I walked calmly down the slope, dust puffing beneath my boots, every step deliberate. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't running. I wanted them to see exactly who they were dealing with. By the time the patrol truck rolled up, lights flashing, Helen was pointing at me like a prosecutor delivering the final blow. But she didn't understand. This wasn't her victory. This was just the beginning. And before the officers stepped out, I knew exactly what I would say next. The police truck rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust, its tires crunching over gravel as two officers stepped out, Officer Ramirez and Officer Dalton, both of whom had been out to my ranch before for normal checks, never conflict. Their boots hit the ground with the heavy rhythm of approaching judgment, but I stood tall, hands resting calmly on my belt. I had nothing to hide. Nothing to fear. Because everything I'd done was legal, deliberate, and recorded. Helen stormed toward them, her silk robe flapping wildly behind her like some furious flag of war. Her face was beet red, hair tangled from the chaos, and her voice cracked as she pointed at her empty pool. Arrest him. He destroyed my property. He sabotaged my home. He stole my water. Dalton blinked. Ma'am, stole your water? Yes, she screeched. He drained my pool. Look at it. Look. The officers exchanged glances. I almost felt bad for them. They looked like two men who had accidentally stepped into the middle of a tornado. Still, Ramirez lifted his notepad and approached me slowly. Morning, sir, he said. Mind telling us what happened? I gestured to the creek. Nature happened. Water followed a lawful path through an old diversion the city abandoned. Completely on my property. No tampering on hers. Helen threw her hands in the air. He's lying. He manipulated it. He broke something. He used machinery, something illegal, something dangerous. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Officers, I said, tapping the screen, before Helen showed up with a demolition crew and destroyed my windmill, I started documenting everything. Here's video evidence of the diversion valve built decades ago, never removed, still fully functional. I reopened it. That's not illegal. It's maintenance. Dalton took the phone, brows lifting as he watched the footage. Ramirez studied the creek bed, then the slope, then the boundary line. Meanwhile, Helen paced in frantic circles, muttering about lawsuits, emergency board meetings, and special HOA interventions. Finally, Ramirez turned to her. Ma'am, he said carefully, nothing here suggests criminal activity. The water moved naturally across land outside city jurisdiction. If you have a civil complaint, you'll need to file it separately. Helen's jaw dropped so hard I almost heard it click. No. 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 You don't understand. He ruined my pool. And you, I said quietly, ruined my windmill. Her face twisted. It was unapproved. And your pool? I asked. Did your HOA approve diverting natural water away from the creek when your development was built? That shut her up instantly. Ramirez cleared his throat. This looks like a civil dispute. Not criminal. Helen stared at the officers like they'd betrayed her personally. The war wasn't over, but I'd won this battle. If Helen thought the cops siding against her was the end of her humiliation, she underestimated just how far the truth could travel in a small town. By afternoon, nearly everyone within 5 miles had heard about the HOA queen who drained her own pool. Phones buzzed with screenshots, neighbors whispered across fences, and ranchers who dealt with her attitude for years finally had something to chuckle about. But if there was one thing Helen hated more than losing, it was looking foolish. And now, she looked like the poster child for suburban disaster. The moment the officers left, she spun toward me, her eyes burning with pure hatred. You think this is funny, she hissed. I shrugged. I think it's natural consequences. She stomped closer, jabbing a finger toward my chest. I'm going to ruin you. I'll bury you in fines. I'll get the board to issue emergency sanctions. You already destroyed my windmill, I interrupted. There's not much further you can go. That struck a nerve. Her mouth clamped shut, and for the first time, real fear flickered across her face. Not fear of me, fear of losing control. Helen thrived on authority. Without it, she was just a loud neighbor with a clipboard. She spun on her heel and marched back into her house, slamming the door hard enough to shake her patio lights. I knew she wouldn't stay quiet long. People like Helen never accepted defeat. They plotted, schemed, reshaped it into something they could weaponize. And she was already planning something. I could feel it. Sure enough, an hour later, I saw SUV after SUV rolling into her driveway. HOA board members. The full squad. They came armed with binders, tablets, and stacks of paperwork that looked like they weighed more than bricks. From my vantage point at the fence line, I watched them gather around her patio table, heads bobbing as Helen ranted for a solid 15 minutes. Her arms swung wildly, pointing at the pool, at the creek, at my land, anywhere she could redirect blame. Then came the part I expected, the glares. The board members turned in unison, looking directly toward my ranch like I was some villain in a courtroom drama. One of them even snapped a photo of my fence. Another scribbled notes furiously. Their posture radiated manufactured indignation. Good. Let them look. Let them try. Because what they didn't know was that I'd already prepared for this. I had documentation, photos, recordings, aerial maps, historical surveys, everything proving the diversion system predated their neighborhood by decades. Every legal angle they could attempt was one I'd already fortified. Helen thought she could crush me with bureaucracy. But she was about to learn something she'd never expected. I played that game better than she did. The following days were a masterclass in tension. Helen became a storm contained within the walls of her house, pacing endlessly, plotting every possible move to counteract the loss of her pool and the embarrassment inflicted by the ranch diversion. Her HOA allies tried to strategize, pulling up maps, pulling up permits, and even questioning the validity of the diversion channels. But no matter how hard they searched, every document, every survey, every historical record pointed back to one undeniable truth: the water had always belonged to my land first. My grandfather's plans, my father's maintenance logs, even city archives confirmed it. Legally, morally, historically, the diversion was mine. I watched it all unfold from the ridge above my property. Every meeting Helen held, every phone call she made, every furious shout that carried across the wind, it was all theater, all desperate attempts to regain control. And yet, each move she made only exposed her arrogance further. Her neighbors began whispering. HOA members started looking uneasy. People love justice, even when it comes in unusual forms, and Helen's tyranny had left a trail that no amount of official documentation could erase from public perception. By day 3, her frustration had reached a fever pitch. She was calling emergency HOA meetings, demanding city inspectors, threatening lawsuits, and posting angry rants in the community forum. But the more she tried to fight, the weaker her arguments became. Photos of her drained pool went viral in local circles, with neighbors tagging each other in disbelief at the absurdity. The local news even caught wind of the story. Rancher versus HOA, the battle over water and pride became a headline, showing Helen's desperation and my calm, collected response. Suddenly, she wasn't just a petty HOA tyrant, she was the laughingstock of the county. Despite the chaos she created, I kept my routine quiet and steady. The ranch still needed care, animals still needed feeding, fences needed repairing. While Helen burned her energy screaming at bureaucracy, I focused on my land, maintaining control where it truly mattered. There's a lesson in patience here: revenge is most effective when it's slow, deliberate, and unshakable. I had no intention of escalating unnecessarily, but I also made sure every move she attempted against me had already been anticipated. By the 4th day, Helen realized that the war she thought she'd started against me had, in fact, backfired spectacularly. She had attacked, I had defended, and now the narrative was entirely mine. She had lost more than water, she'd lost dignity, influence, and credibility. And all the while, the ranch stood untouched, the windmill blades swaying in the breeze as if mocking her every failed maneuver. This was the turning point. Helen might have called the cops, sued, or tried intimidation tactics, but now it was clear who truly controlled the battlefield. The war was nearing its climax, and I was ready for the final act. By the fifth day, the tide had fully turned. Helen's fury no longer intimidated anyone, not the HOA board, not her neighbors, not even me. Her frantic energy had become predictable, almost cartoonish, shouting, pacing, and making increasingly desperate calls to city offices. Meanwhile, my ranch thrived, the windmill finally repaired with the help of old family tools, the creek flowing naturally, and the animals grazing peacefully. Everything I had fought for remained intact. Everything she tried to destroy had become her undoing. Helen called yet another emergency HOA meeting, demanding an immediate investigation into my illegal actions. She expected allies to rally behind her, expecting them to nod in solemn agreement at her outrage. Instead, they questioned her tone, her methods, even her competence. The board had begun siding with reason, and reason pointed squarely to me. My documentation, photographs, and historical records left no gaps. Every claim Helen made collapsed under scrutiny. The power she wielded so arrogantly had evaporated. Finally, in a public hearing that she hoped would intimidate me, Helen presented her case with all the theatrics of a courtroom drama. Her arms flailed, her voice cracked, her words tumbled over each other. But when I presented my evidence, calmly, precisely, with maps, dates, and a clear explanation of the natural water flow, the room fell silent. It wasn't my victory that stunned them, it was Helen's complete collapse. Her once mighty persona shriveled under scrutiny, leaving a woman who had misjudged the very people she sought to manipulate. Neighbors whispered, HOA members nodded, and even the city inspector, who had been skeptical at first, gave a nod of approval. I stood quietly, watching her rage falter into helpless disbelief. The pool? A drained, cracked relic. The windmill? Restored. My reputation? Untouched and respected. Her war had not only failed, it had exposed her for what she truly was, reckless, entitled, and unable to understand that actions have consequences. As Helen stormed out, muttering threats that no one took seriously, I walked to the ridge overlooking the ranch, the sun dipping low and casting golden light across the fields. My grandfather's windmill spun lazily in the breeze, a symbol of resilience. My land, my life, my peace intact. And Helen? Reduced to fury and frustration, powerless to touch what she had tried so hard to destroy. Victory was never about destruction. It was about control, patience, and letting natural justice play out. And in the end, nature combined with careful planning had delivered a lesson far stronger than any words, fines, or threats could have. I took a deep breath, the windmill creaking softly behind me, and allowed myself a quiet smile. The HOA had attacked, I had responded, and the balance had been restored. The war was over, and I had won without breaking a single law, without stepping foot on her property, simply by staying calm, prepared, and relentless.